Hawaii remains on alert this morning, and all eyes are on Mount Kilauea.
Scientists on the island are bracing for a possible steam eruption. Now, that explosion could send boulders the size of refrigerators thousands of feet into the sky. And while they wait, other concerns remain. So over the weekend, several new volcanic fissures opened up.
We're talking 17 active vents continue to pour toxic gas and lava, devastating the Big Island. The first fissure opened up almost 2 weeks ago now. So when scientists closely watching Kilauea for that possible steam eruption, we wanted to take a closer look at what actually would cause that to happen.
Meteorologist Tim Pandagis is here to explain what's going on just beneath the surface. Tim.
Hey, good morning, guys. Kilauea is one of the most active volcanoes in the world, and it's located in a place that's geologically unique. Throughout the world, just below the surface are tectonic plates. These are large slabs of earth sitting on top of a massive pool of liquid magma. These plates are continuously moving and collide with one another. These collisions translate into earthquakes at the Earth's surface that sometimes correlate with volcanic eruptions. The United States and most of North America are located on top of the North American plate, one that does not see much in the way of seismic activity aside from a few stress faults. However, the collision zone between the North American and Pacific plate along the west coast causes a lot more in the way of earthquake action. This all takes place along the San Andreas Fault. Now on to where the real action is, way out west in the middle of the Pacific. Looking at Hawaii on a map, it is located in a pretty good spot, right smack dab in the middle of the Pacific plate. Not a collision zone in sight. So what is causing the earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? Hawaii is not only unique in its beautiful scenery, but geologically as well. You see, the island chain has been formed over millions of years by being located right on top of something called a hot spot. Basically what this is a weak spot in the Pacific plate, allowing magma to make it to the surface, slowly oozing out and creating island after island in the chain. As the plate has slowly migrated northwest, a different location moved over the hot spot, hence why the Big Island is the newest in the chain and also the only island with active volcanoes. The type of volcano is also important. It's called a shield volcano, one that is broad and domed with slow eruptions. Volcanoes are very unpredictable and no one knows just how long this may last. What we do know is that the Big Island continues to grow, and more eruptions in the future are certainly likely. That lava pouring out of the earth is no joke, but how hot is it? How about 2,100 degrees? Enough to incinerate anything it comes in contact with. Let's compare. A lightning bolt is 50,000 degrees. The surface of the sun, right around 10,000 degrees.
Unbelievable.
Incredible. Truly. And the fact that these people have that kind of menace over them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and they'll be watching, too, if the lava interacts with the groundwater, that interaction there is explosive.
Oh, wow.
So if that was to happen, that's why they're expecting the possibility of a massive explosion.
Okay.
We'll see.
Good
See what happens.
All right, good explanation.